Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we offer a brief lesson from a section of today's reading in the One Year Bible. My name's Stephen Mizell, and Jay Rivenbark and I are joined today by Alyssa, Bream, and we're looking at Psalm 137, where the writer says, "We have hung our harps in the willows." And we talk about the power of lament, why lamenting is necessary for healing, how we can pray honestly and not become bitter, and how exile can give us a longing for God's kingdom. So I hope you'll get your Bible and a pen and paper, and let's have a discussion around God's Word today. Hey everyone, today we're in the Psalm reading of the One Year Bible. And it's a lament. It's written while they're in exile, and Israel's sitting by Babylon's rivers. They're mourning the destruction of Jerusalem, and their captors are mocking them. That's what this is. What's happening here? They're sing one of your songs from Zion. And the refrain is, "How can we sing when everything we love is lost?" So it captures this deep grief they have, maybe even a righteous anger from people who are far from home. Was there a piece of this that you wanted to make sure we talked about today?
I think foundational to talking about laments is that they are not complaining. And sometimes in life, it's easy to complain about something and maybe to try to make it overly spiritual, like, well, that's a lament. But really, the lament is always grounded in a deep faith in God, and it isn't complaining. So you can't use that like, they made my burrito wrong. That's not a lament.
There's a couple areas here. One was the reality as it is in here. We often don't appreciate what we have until we don't have it.
Right.
That some of the greatest, at least for me on a personal level, some of the greatest pain, anguish, lamenting have come at times and seasons in my life where, whether it be temporary or more permanently, things that I lost that I didn't really appreciate on the front end. And then when you don't have it, you realize how much it did mean to you. And the other thing is that the reality is when you do go through life and struggle and or in loss or pain and suffering, not everybody is going to be there to encourage you and support you like this group of people. There are people who are going to rejoice because you're going through a bad place. And particularly if you've lost something that they are glad of, as it was their freedoms and liberties here. There are people who are opposed to what you're trying to do, even if you are God's children.
What I was looking for wasn't a sermon that I'd preached long ago, but actually we preached this text in 2022. But when I was at my first church, I preached from this text, used the same title both times, 2022, but it wasn't the same sermon, about how sometimes things that were once redeeming qualities, gifts in our life, what we were known for, are not useful because of the situation that we find ourselves in at that particular time. And I think this concept of lament, I do think sometimes it's hard to know the difference between a lament and a complaint. I think we have to understand that faith doesn't want us to suppress our sorrow. I think it sanctifies our sorrow. That's the piece I think that we read in the Psalms, is that the sorrow becomes sanctified, in that they always end with some kind of turn, toward praise. And, I think we can bring our pain to God. We don't have to bury it and pretend like we don't have it. The hard part, I think the difficulty of laments, and maybe this will be a transition into our first question. I think some of the challenge of laments are that we read this I don't think the psalmist wrote this with the intent or expectation somebody else was going to read it thousands of years later out of context. And I think sometimes the reason why laments sound like complaints to us is because they were never meant for our ears anyway. Sometimes they do come to our ears, but they were never meant for our ears anyway. But why is lament a piece of or necessary for healing?
I think it's a big part of the grieving process. When you talk about healing, there are times and situations and seasons in life that do break you, that are overwhelming. But lamenting the sorrow, the pain, and expressing that, it's part of the grieving process that I think is necessary to get to a place of healing. And, that starts with the acknowledgement of the realities of it versus denial. And that's a step in the process. And so long term, there has to be, or should be, I should say, should be some form of lamenting and grieving before you can come out the backside and experience genuine healing.
Yeah, you have to have that honesty with yourself and with those around you and with God especially, because if you're pretending like a really bad situation didn't affect you, it's going to affect you in ways that you don't even realize years down the road. So that honesty and expressing it to God especially will help that not turn into something that becomes bitter in your own life.
Yeah, I think honesty does keep pain from turning into bitterness. And I think pain has to be expressed for healing, just in physical terms. We have a pain. We talk to a medical physician about it, but it's the pain, it's the expression of the pain that helps them know what to look for. If we just go in and say, "Hey, give me a once over," we don't know what needs working on. But if there's some pain associated with it, we can identify, hey, I'm having trouble with my arm or my finger or, whatever the case may be. And we can find some help in that. And I think because we have to be careful that we don't become bitter. And so how do you pray honestly and not become bitter?
Laments always end putting their trust in God. And maybe that's the theme of this week, where it's like that it's really bad, but I know, God, that you are still here and that you are still in control. It's not saying something that you don't believe is like, you're not saying, but I'm okay now, I think on like a practical level that either writing or speaking it is really important. I feel like sometimes prayers that are thought or emotions that are thought can get stuck, and you kind of get stuck in maybe the bad place, like the really bad part of something. But when you write it out, I have found that writing it out, you end up ending at a place and you end up like, oh, but you can end with the hope and with the situation resolving because you were able to get it out and it comes out. And we've talked about that with journaling in some different groups we've been in. And I think that is an important part of this, is there has to be an actual expression of it. It can't just be thought in your head.
Yeah, it has to be open, transparent, honesty, pouring yourself out. I think if in times of difficulty, pain, loss, suffering, whatever the category may be, if you're praying only for rescue and deliverance and it doesn't come the way you perceive it, I think it's easy to become bitter. You're lamenting and sharing your feelings and emotions to God and just laying it out there. It does begin the healing process, and it's different than just wanting the rescue from the crisis. Tends to be selfish, and oftentimes we don't learn through that process. If every time we went through a difficult time and season we prayed, immediate answer came, there's no growth in that process. But honesty with God is required if it's going to be true lamenting and impactful for us.
I've been trying to find a good illustration, but I read somewhere that you should aim your grief toward God, not at Him. That sometimes laments should be intended to get God's attention, to know that He can, it's a dependence on Him. But sometimes if they turn into bitterness, they become weapons that we aim at God. We blame God for the situation. And I think a lament is the belief and trust that God is listening, even though our life hurts at this particular moment, that He's paying attention.
Yeah, I think lament positions us to go into the arms of God, as it were. Whereas when we're angry at God and aiming that, it puts a distance. It's like putting our arm out away from Him that we can't get but so close. Whereas a lament positions us to go close to Him.
So they're in exile here. What can exile and reading about the exile teach us about longing for God's kingdom?
Well, as the exile did for the Jewish people, first they had opportunity to avoid it many times on the front end, but they didn't. They got there. And it was only when they recognized what they really lost that they understood the value of what they had. And then that process of exile created an environment where they longed to be back home and to experience what was rightfully theirs through God. And so sometimes pain, loss, suffering, the seasons that cause us to lament actually create an environment that when we're restored, maybe it's physical health, maybe it's a relationship, maybe it's financial issues, that once we get back to that place, we can value and appreciate and be grateful for it on a level that we never would have previously.
When the three of us were together, we talked a lot about exile and about Daniel. And I think that looking at his life, we can see how you can live faithfully in those tough situations. And, if you're working in a situation that there's people around you that don't follow God, that are doing things, I think the exile is a great reminder that you can walk faithfully and do hard things and still get along with those around you. That doing the right thing shouldn't cause you to build up walls and create tension in the workplace and in tough situations. It should be able to be done in a way that creates that longing and that hope in yourself and maybe awakens it in other people.
Self-imposed exile. I shouldn't say self-imposed, but self-inflicted. That would be a way to say it. Often what was our strength becomes mockery, but only when the purpose of it has been removed do we long for it back. So I'll give you a different story in just a minute that would maybe bring this home. When I read this, what I read are some people who were skilled musicians, wonderful singers, whose gift was known even by the Babylonians, how they worshiped. But their idolatry and sin that led them into exile, now it was a mockery. They made fun of them. I have read stories about famous preachers who ended up in prison, for one reason or another, and how what was on the outside a gift became mocked, in that moment. The other story that this reminds me of, because what happens, I think, is when the gift, because that's what I read here, is the harps hanging in the willow trees, is they realized what they had abandoned. They understood what they had lost and they desired it back. The story that it reminds me of is Samson. He had all of this strength and he was doing all of these great things, and they cut his hair off, and he doesn't even know that God has left him. He goes out and pretends like everything is normal, and then they take him, and then he becomes the mockery of the Philistines. They gouge his eyes out. He's grinding grain. But in that process, though, his desire to be used by God one more time, begins to fill his heart. And he prays one prayer just one last time, Lord, let me, let your power be revealed in me. And I think that for me, having what I feel like were moments of exile, mostly self-inflicted, it makes you appreciate the gifts of God much more than if you didn't. It's easy to take things for granted, and man, that's the last thing. I'm not saying I'm perfect at it, but it's the last thing I want to do at this point in my life, is to take for granted the gifts God has given me, because I never want to be back in that place where it's a mockery and I'm in self-inflicted exile, and I just want one more time to be used of God. So, thank you for joining us again today on One Single Story. I just want to remind you that from tears by the river to songs of restoration, God doesn't leave his people in exile forever. And that's the hope that all of us can have. Hope you'll join us again on the next edition of One Single Story.